Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion on the living legacies of the Exiles of Florida, which has been made possible by a generous grant from the state of Florida commemorating America at 250. Our session today features two scholars, Dr. Canter Brown Jr., who's authored scores of works, including, touching upon Florida history, and Dr. Uzi Baram, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at New College, who's dedicated much of his career to archaeological research on heritage locations in different sites throughout Florida. In 1990, Canter Brown provided the first scholarly treatment of a community of free blacks and self-emancipated slaves on southern Tampa Bay, and he identified it as Angola. Brown took the name from a Cuban fisherman's unsuccessful 1828 land claim for 640 acres along the Manatee River. Based on Brown's research, Uzi Baram began looking for evidence of Angola along the Manatee and eventually located portions of the Maroon community, which facilitated the new heritage site at the Manatee Mineral Springs Park in Bradenton. I'm Will Hustwit, Associate Professor of History at New College, and I'll be talking with Professors Brown and Baram about the research and reevaluation of a largely forgotten abolitionist text, Joshua Reed Giddings' The Exiles of Florida, before opening up discussion to you, our audience, who's here both in person and online. First, a few introductory remarks about the subject of our panel. Mention the name Joshua Reed Giddings, and few people would nod in recognition. In the antebellum era, however, Giddings was both recognized and reviled as a formidable figure in the radical abolitionist movement. Born in 1795, Giddings' life spanned almost the entirety of the abolitionist struggle. An Ohio congressman and later U.S. Consul General in Canada, where he died in 1864, less than a year before passage of the 13th Amendment and abolition of slavery, Giddings was a fierce critic of slavery. During the 1840s and 1850s, Giddings was at the forefront of the abolitionist cause and championed a wide range of issues, including opposition to the gag rule, defending the Creole rebels, opposing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, encouraging bloodshed to resist slavery, including advising fugitive slaves to resist their captors, and helping to recruit Abraham Lincoln to the new anti-slavery Republican Party. In 1858, Giddings published his life's work, The Exiles of Florida, or, and this is the full title, The Exiles of Florida, or the Crimes Committed by Our Government Against the Maroons, who fled from South Carolina and other slave states, seeking protection under Spanish laws. And he did this to reveal the U.S. government's support of slavery. Not one to pull punches, Giddings argued that the federal government had prostituted itself to the forces of slavery and provided documentation of American policy in Spanish La Florida and on the struggles of the Maroons, or exiles, as he insisted on calling them, to live in freedom. After the introductory abolitionist disclaimer not to withhold the truth, Giddings set a harrowing scene, and I wanted to read you just a little bit of the intro. Torn from their native land, their friends and homes, they were sold in the markets of Carolina and Georgia. Feeling the hand of oppression bearing heavily upon them, they fled to Florida, and under Spanish laws became free. Holding lands of the Spanish crown, they became citizens of that territory entitled to protection. To regain possession of their truant bondmen, Georgia made war upon Florida, but failed to obtain her object, referring to the 1812 Patriot War. At a time of profound peace, our army, acting under the direction of the executive, invaded Florida, murdered many of these free men, and brought others to the United States and consigned them to slavery. An expensive and bloody war followed, but failing to capture more of the exiles, our army was withdrawn. This war was followed by diplomatic efforts. Giddings goes on to describe some of those, and then talks about during its protracted continuance of 7 years of warfare, bribery, and treachery were practiced towards the exiles and their allies, the Seminole Indians. Flags of truce were violated. The pledged faith of the nation was disregarded. By these means, the removal of the exiles from Florida was effected. After they had settled in the Western country, most of these inequities were repeated until they were driven from our nation and compelled to seek an asylum in Mexico. Men who wielded the influence of government for the consummation of these crimes assiduously labored to suppress all knowledge of their guilt, to keep facts from the popular mind, to falsify the history of current events, and prevent an exposure of our national turpitude. Giddings then established his narrative in the early chapters by frequently interrupting a factual account based on official documents with his reflections on the daily routines, feelings, or thoughts of the exiles as they cultivated the land, forged communities, and pursued homemaking in Florida. For example, when Giddings presents the history of U.S. attempts to claim Africans in Spanish Florida during the 1790s, he cites and quotes from texts authored by a number of prominent officials, including the governor of Georgia, an Indian agent to the Creek, the U.S. Secretary of War, officials of the Spanish Crown, and even President George Washington. But then abruptly breaks from his account, cutting to an imagined scene in the swamps of Florida. While those incidents were transpiring, the exiles were engaged in cultivating their lands, extending their plantations, and increasing their flocks and herds, and consolidating their friendships with the Indians around them. Of all these facts, the bondmen of Georgia had full knowledge. It was impossible for them to contemplate their friends in the enjoyment of these rights and privileges without a strong desire to share in those blessings of freedom. The example of the exiles was thus constantly exerting an influence upon those who remained in bondage. Many of them sought opportunities to flee into Florida, where they, in like manner, became free subjects of Spain. Such juxtapositions prompt readers toward a number of realizations. First, Africans established themselves in Florida long before the origin of the United States. Second, Africans in Florida were permanent landholders, even according to the terms of possession familiar to most white Americans. In Florida, they owned property, cultivated and improved the earth, and established farms that they sometimes bequeathed to their children. Third, until U.S. troops invaded Florida during the 19th century, African settlement of the peninsula continued uninterrupted, and many families had occupied the land for several generations. Fourth, Africans enjoyed legal freedom under Spanish rule, and they had never belonged to anyone, according to Giddings, least of all the Seminole, with whom their relationship was one of voluntary and communal friendship. He always referred to it as friendship. Fifth, Africans in Florida did nothing to provoke U.S. aggression, since they were in fact quietly enjoying their freedom and considered themselves to be free. And finally, we need to re-examine the Exiles of Florida as an entry point for reconstructing the lives of freedom-seeking people and maroon communities during Florida's Second Spanish period from 1783 to 1821, and the ensuing Seminole Wars of the mid-19th century, and to reimagine the exile story as one of resistance and resilience rather than defeat and rediscovery. In 1964, when the University of Florida Press reprinted the Exiles of Florida to celebrate Florida's 400th anniversary, then Governor Ferris Bryant quoted Carl Sandburg, who said, quote, "Books say yes to life, or they say no," end quote. The Exiles of Florida is a book that says yes to life. To better understand the living legacies of the Exiles of Florida, please welcome Dr. Canter Brown and Dr. Uzi Baram.
Good morning. It's my job to ask the question, why Florida? And unfortunately, we're going to have to introduce some history into it. And even though I'm a retired history professor, I mean, it's just too irresistible not to do it. And so I'm going to start in this building. I'm going to use advanced audio-visual aids, which you will recognize as the U.S. Capitol on May 8th, 1856. Now, by way of context, as we will see, this book, The Exiles of Florida, was published 2 years later in 1858. All right. On May the 8th, Joshua Giddings collapsed during debate on an issue involving, tangentially, slavery. He was, a description of the event in a newspaper said, Mr. G was seized with sudden indisposition and fell fainting to the floor. Much confusion ensued, and Mr. Giddings was borne to the window where, after exposure to the air, he in a few moments recovered. He had 8 years to live at that point. This was him at the time. You can see that 20 years in the Congress almost had worn him down. I want to underscore what Will said. Even though he has been mostly forgotten in our time, he was a giant of his time who stood astride the abolition movement, and sometimes with only one or two allies in Congress, pressed the cause forward at every opportunity that he could find. Now, January 17th, 1857, still in Congress, he again collapsed during a debate that again involved abolition. His biographer wrote, stricken with heart disease, he did not die as all thought he would. He was old in years, weary with service, and shattered in health. What to do to preserve his cause of freedom? His answer finally came. He was going to write a book. It encouraged him to move forward when in March, after his second heart attack, the Dred Scott decision was issued by the United States Supreme Court, in which, to its eternal disgrace, the court ruled that persons of African descent were not human beings. They were property. Well, here's a very ill man who still has the duties of a congressman. How in the world would he write a major work, much less one on a subject as remote as Florida? Well, it turned out there was an answer. He had the best legislative research service in the world to help him. We call it the Library of Congress today. It wasn't on the corner across the street from the Capitol like we see the library today. It was on the west front of the Capitol, inside the Capitol itself. Its staff existed in terms of providing service almost totally to provide research services to members of Congress. Giddings, as a very senior member, in fact, many referred to him at the time as the Dean of the House of Representatives, was able to call upon the enormous resources available at the library. There was no National Archives, you might want to know, until 1934. I know this is an aside. Florida was the last state in the Union to get an archives. I wonder if they would have gotten it even then had it not been so shameful that they didn't have one. Anyway, the book was finally published in 1858 on June 15th. Interestingly, even the publisher was a little worried about how far he had gone. The publisher was Follett, Foster and Company of Columbus, Ohio, and of course Follett is still a major publisher. This was their first big venture into abolitionism. They published advertisements in newspapers all over the country, and in pointing interested readers to what they might find interesting in the book, it was the heroism of Osceola. They were that nervous. But it turned out the book was a huge success in the North and the Midwest. But that still doesn't answer the question, why Florida, does it? Okay, let's go back again. 1835. Everybody's wanted to hear about 1835 today, right? Let's start with an event that is mostly forgotten today. The American Anti-Slavery Society was a tiny, tiny group. And they were trying to figure out a way to get some attention, to get the abolition movement actually moving in a positive direction. And they decided what they would do is take the money they had, print up all the abolitionist materials they could do, and have friendly congressmen send them in the mails free all over the South. Well, Southerners, white Southerners didn't take to that very well. And this is a picture of an event that same year in Charleston, South Carolina, where a mob attacked the post office, took out the mails, and burned them in the streets. President Andrew Jackson, who had the opportunity, of course, to put things on a good course as a good Tennessee slaveholder himself, who had been intimately involved in the affairs of Florida, allowed his postmaster general to instruct Southern postmasters that if they found the mails objectionable, just don't deliver them. Andrew Jackson. Amos Kellogg, by the way, to his eternal disgrace, was the postmaster. Excuse me. At the same time, war was brewing in Florida. In good part at the behest of Red Stick Creeks, who had come to Florida in the 18-teens, and black warriors under the leadership of Osceola, who was not a Seminole, he was a Red Stick Creek, and Harry, who was the war chief of a village at what's now Bartow called Menifee. They began raiding all over the frontier, as it then existed in Florida, through 1835. Finally, they created such an attitude of desire for resistance to Andrew Jackson's attempts to move them out of Florida to some reservation in the West. Finally, the Indians and the blacks decided to create an incident so severe that everyone would have to take sides. Now, by taking sides, it was a question of the Seminoles. The Seminoles were cattle people. If they went to war, they would lose their cattle and their wealth. And some of the Seminoles were quite wealthy. So it was a problem. The solution was a column of soldiers left Fort Brooke at what's now Tampa, marching up to what's now Ocala, which then was called Fort King. Along the way, they were met by a group that included the Seminole chief Micanopy and massacred. Over 100 men were killed. This is one image you don't see very often, but it was drawn when the battlefield was first visited a couple of months later, and the skeletons of all the dead were still lying in place. Now, I've talked about Red Stick Creeks and about Seminoles, and how do you get the Seminoles to go to war, even though we call it the Seminole War? And so we've seen them put them in a position they had to choose. And they didn't have a good choice from their perspective, but they were forced to fight. The thing is, though, the war wasn't so much perceived as an Indian war. Because, now, I'm going to take responsibility for what I'm about to say, and many historians will vehemently disagree with this. But I think a good argument can be made that the Second Seminole War, which began in December 1835, was the largest slave rebellion in United States history. My colleague Larry Rivers, in his book Slavery in Florida, which I encourage all of y'all to look at, estimates that there were almost 1,000 slaves, if not more, who abandoned plantations and came within the Indian lands and the Maroon lands, and at least for a time fought for their freedom as part of the war. Very famously, General Thomas Jessup in 1837 reported to Washington, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war." Now, to back up that case, here is a pamphlet that was published in the year after the war broke out. Horrid massacres by rebelling slaves. And here's a cartoon that was published broadly, "Massacre of the Whites by the Indians and Blacks in Florida." So right away, while it is true that many Seminoles ended up fighting in the war, and virtually all the Red Stick Creeks and Maroons, including Maroons who were descended from peoples who occupied Angola here in Bradenton. The fact is that freed slaves who had freed themselves at the beginning of the war provided a great part of the muscle that allowed it to move ahead. Now, Andrew Jackson, the old boy, was still around. He's still president. His successor will be elected later in 1836 as vice president, Martin Van Buren. He's a mean old cuss. I don't know how to say it. And he had a burn on for Florida and particularly for the Maroons and the Red Stick Creeks in Florida. So by God, he wasn't going to let them get away with this. So he ended up getting us into a war that they couldn't get out of. And it finally just petered out in 1842. But in the meantime, it was one of the most controversial, ongoing events in United States history, even though today we virtually have forgotten. In the Congress, Jackson's allies got tired in their anger, including at the temerity of these blacks in Florida to rebel and fight, that they decided to punish, since they couldn't punish the blacks and people in Florida, because at the first year of the war, they were winning. They decided to punish the abolitionists. Why not? Blame them. Well, they introduced what was called the gag rule. Will alluded to it earlier. 1836, abolitionist petitions in the U.S. House of Representatives were automatically tabled upon introduction. Just won't discuss them. We're not going to hear the subject. This is in the United States Congress now. It was still a year and a half before Joshua Giddings made his way to Washington in December of 1838. Elected as a Whig out of the Western Reserve in Ohio, the northeast portion, one of the most abolitionist-prone areas of the country at the time. And he was absolutely committed to the cause of freedom for the slaves. But he took his time feeling his way into leadership. And he didn't emerge in the forum of leadership as a major figure until February the 8th, 1841. This is what he looked like then. Let me show you again the difference that 20 years will make. But this was him, full of fire and vigor. Another issue had come up in February of 1841. The Congress was about to be handed by the Democrats to the Whigs. There was a new day. Why not get rid of the gag rule? Giddings' colleague, John Quincy Adams, the former president, attempted to introduce a repeal of the gag rule. They immediately laid it upon the table. Giddings then rose and on a tangential issue began testing what was permitted as a discussion subject within the U.S. House of Representatives. And he chose Florida and the Black Slave Rebellion in Florida. So we know he was paying close attention, even though he was not yet in Congress, to all of these things. And in a mini edition of the Exiles of Florida, he reviewed the history of slavery and black yearning for freedom in Florida on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives on that day. It made him a star. I don't know how else to say it. In a small context. Again, there weren't many abolitionists. Lincoln's friend Ben Wade was one. There were just John Quincy Adams, the former president, was one, but a handful only. And it stayed that way through most of the 1840s. And then, oh, by the way, his speech was so successful in 1841 that newspapers reprinted it all over the country. And then booklets were published by anti-slavery societies all over the country. The Florida speech of Joshua Giddings, February 8th. Okay, he's still in Congress, still fighting for the cause. 1847 in December, 9 years after he arrived in Washington, and he got a roommate at his boarding house. This fellow, who had just been elected as the only Whig congressman from Illinois, next Ohio. And Giddings took this fellow under his wing. And I mentioned earlier that the Library of Congress then was not where it is now. It then was in the Capitol, not across the street. This is what was across the street, their rooming house. That's where Lincoln and Giddings lived. It was owned by Miss Stillings. It was called Miss Spriggs, Ann Spriggs, and it was called Carroll Row. And there, Giddings began working on building a friendship with Abraham Lincoln and trying to convince him to the cause of abolitionism, which Lincoln was very slow to accept. Well, at this point, Giddings is, although they remained friends for life, and during the Civil War, Lincoln would quickly appoint him as Consul General to Canada, essentially our ambassador to Canada. 1854 and 55, as Will alluded to, Giddings helped lead, with Lincoln's help, the creation of the Republican Party. And then at the end of the second year there, December of 1855, Indian War broke out again in Florida. How many people realize we had an Indian War in Florida just before the Civil War? Yeah, the third Seminole War, sometimes called the Billy Bowlegs War, brought Florida back into the news, brought recollections of the second Seminole War back into the national consciousness. And of course, it was right on the heels of that, months into that conflict, that he stood on May 8, 1856, preaching against abolitionism and having his first heart attack. In June, when the Exiles of Florida finally was published, it was still one of the major topics covered in the nation's newspapers, as Billy Bowlegs, namesake of the war, was carried by the U.S. military west as an exile from Florida. So that's why Florida. Billy Bowlegs.
Thank you. Uzi?
Thank you, Canter. So I'm here to talk about the archaeology, and in many ways it feels like one of my roles is to be the memory keeper for this project and for the work that's been done. It was 2 decades ago that I met Canter Brown on this very campus, where we kicked off an interdisciplinary research team that was titled Looking for Angola. At the time, Angola was basically a legend. Some fragments of history that gave us a sense that something might have been going on, but in a lot of ways, in a phrase that an anthropologist had come up with, it felt unthinkable that this area here was a center of anti-slavery resistance, that somehow there were hundreds of people who were part of resistance to enslavement, free blacks, multiple generations here in this very region. 20 years later, we have, thanks to archaeological research, excavations and recovery analysis, a clear sense of the temporal and geographic aspects of the early 19th century Angola Maroon community. And thanks to the Exiles of Florida, it's not an unthinkable history, but one that's animated, that one that gives us a clear sense of the people and their struggles, and fits well what Joshua Reed Giddings had described in the 1858 book. So I'm going to do, similar to Will, some readings out of the book. At the start of chapter 3, Giddings lays out, when Mr. Madison assumed the duties of president, that was March 4th, 1809, for those who don't have that handy, quote, the exiles were quietly enjoying their freedom, each sitting under their own vine and fig tree, without molestation or fear. Many had been born in the Seminole country and now saw around them children and grandchildren in the enjoyment of all the necessities of life, unquote. Giddings recognized that even though they were living peacefully under those vines and fig trees, they were part of a fierce resistance against slavery. Later in that book, quote again quoting, with the exiles, there was no alternative other than war or slavery, and they greatly preferred death upon the battlefield to chains and the scourge. We may well suppose they would fight with some degree of desperation under such circumstances, and the Battle of Suwannee gave evidence of their devotion to freedom. As some of you hopefully know, in April of 1818, Andrew Jackson came down to Florida and attacked the community of Maroons and Seminoles at Suwannee, and the military records are clear. The black warriors held them off. And while the U.S. could claim a victory in destroying the community at Suwannee, the people themselves found a haven where others of their family members, friends, allies had already been living. And this is thanks to Canter Brown's research at Angola in the southern part of Tampa Bay. In fact, that's what Giddings tells us, that after the War of 1818, quote, Indians were to settle south of Tampa Bay, excluding the coast, at least 15 miles in width. This was a large community, finding a haven south of Tampa Bay. Now, as an archaeologist, I will tell you, it would have been really so much easier if Mr. Giddings had provided more precision. And even after Canter Brown provided the identification of the Manatee River, which is 60 miles in length, the research as an archaeologist would have been much simpler But thanks to tremendous community support and students at New College way back then from 2005 to 2014, we were able to confirm the location of a part of Angola by the Manatee Mineral Springs in what's basically East Bradenton right now. And thanks for even more support from community members, including descendants, who insisted on coming back to Angola starting in 2018. We were able to have support from the city of Bradenton in the state of Florida to do large-scale excavations in January 2020 that revealed the insights into the daily lives of these freedom-seeking people and a much better sense of the origin of the community in the 1770s, its growth after the battles in 1812 and 1818, and sadly, but not the end of the story, the destruction of the community in 1821. But the story didn't end. The title for this panel is The Living Legacies of the Exiles of Florida. And there's two aspects to those living legacies. One is the people themselves, the ones who were able to escape that destruction, many of whom went to Andros Island in the British Bahamas, where they could find peace and liberty with their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, maybe more. And the other is the living legacy of the book itself, particularly the force of its argument. I read it 20 years ago when I joined the Looking for Angola team, and I read it before coming to this panel. And that strength is still there in the rereading. The insistence on the humanity of the Maroons, even in a time where the majority ideology, the people all around Giddings, were insisting, demanding, requiring the dehumanization of these people. We recognize, thanks to Giddings' force of arguments, his passion, which is hard to miss in this book and in those other speakers, that the places where we excavated are sacred ground, a place where the struggle for liberty and freedom occurred, and that throughout each level of the excavations, both of the history and the actual site, we're recovering something, and again I'm going to quote from Giddings, quote, "The love of liberty is universal. We honor the individuals who give high evidence of this attachment to this fundamental right with which God has endowed all men. We applaud him who manfully defends his liberty, whether it be a Washington with honors clustered upon his brow, or the more humble individual who defends his liberty in Florida by slaying the man who attempts to deprive him of it." Right? This was not a peaceful endeavor, and we should not fool ourselves today in thinking this was an easy dynamic. It was not. People had to fight to defend themselves, to defend their families, their friends, and most importantly, to defend their freedom and their liberty, and they did. We have many legacies from this book. I think about what compelled me over 20 years of, frankly, challenges to continue in this endeavor, and I think Canter just described it well, those who came before, who really did put their lives at risk to tell this story, to demand that freedom matters, and matters tremendously. As an archaeologist, I have a line that I like repeating over and over again, that archaeologists have the unusual task of saving the lives of people who have passed. And we usually focus that on the people represented by the materials that we find through excavations. But I think it also applies to some of the authors of books, like people such as Joshua Reed Giddings. I'm going to quote again. I'm going to quote from the Atlantic magazine, which is still around and was around in this period. In September 1858, it was published in June, and the review was published in September. We don't do that anymore. We're not as quick. This is a nice, quick review. The last paragraph commented on Congress, and I quote, that Giddings is one of the 2 or 3 in Congress that are household words on the lips of the nation. And it will so remain and be familiar in the mouths of prosperity, with a fame as pure as it is noble. Continuing to quote, the ear that had not heard him shall bless him. The eye that has not seen him shall give witness to him. Unquote. Sadly, as Canter has just made clear and Will did before, we have forgotten Joshua Reed Giddings. But part of our task is to recover that life and to think about the inspiration of this individual. He wasn't alone. There were many others who took up the task of supporting the Maroons in their fight. We honor the Maroons themselves, their descendants, but I'm not a descendant, and so I think about the other allies over those generations. I think of Moses Eli Levy, who was a slave owner, but also published a plan in 1828 for the abolition of slavery here in Florida. As a person in Florida, there are many others who we seem to have forgotten, but we have the task in front of us of remembering them, and I think the first step is remembering the Exiles of Florida, the book, and the people. And even though in many ways the history is sad, as Canter points out, when Billy Bowlegs is sent to exile in what would be Indian territory forever, but is now Oklahoma, and the ones who just took on the dangerous journey across the Florida Straits to get to Andros Island and live in the British Bahamas, now the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. We recognize that it wasn't forgotten, that it was carried with the people, and that this session is part of a weekend celebration. The Back to Angola Festival, where the exiles have returned to where their ancestors have been. And as another archaeologist had written, that the archaeology is an avenue to ancestors. It's a conduit to the renewal of history that will be able to this weekend walk on the very ground, and again, as an archaeologist, the very ground based on material evidence, where ancestors had been, where we can celebrate the heritage of Angola with the descendants, where we can be clear that Giddings should be familiar today, that we should see him and hear him and keep that flame of freedom alive. So thank you for listening.
Thank you both. We have time for questions. We love questions. Yeah.
Hi. Any of the descendants that were, of freedom seekers, enslaved, that were taken back into slavery into the South, are there records of who they may be?
Yes.
And have they been contacted? Or
Oh, the descendants. The Angola was destroyed in a massive Coweta Creek slave raid in the late spring or early summer of 1821, probably at the behest of Andrew Jackson, because his principal ally, William McIntosh, who was the Coweta Creek chief, was also Jackson's subordinate as a brigadier general in the United States Army. His people were the ones who destroyed it. but they were only able to capture somewhat less than 300 residents of Angola.
Out of approximately 600?
Well, it's a real guess. I've used the figure 700 to 750, but it is just a guess.
Sure.
Even at that, though, it was the largest Maroon community in Florida at the time. But there are lists. This became very controversial. And there are lists that the government was forced to produce of the individuals who were taken. The thing is, though, before the lists were prepared, about a third of them disappeared. And so we don't know who they were or who took them. Since I'm already said nasty things about Andrew Jackson, it's an interesting coincidence that at that very time when he was having financial problems, he suddenly found the wealth to build the Hermitage, his mansion outside of Nashville. Maybe he hit the lotto. I mean, I don't know. But theoretically, you could take those lists and with the kinds of resources that are available now, perhaps track down some of those people. We certainly know descendants in Andros Island who have become good friends to this community. I wanted to mention, by the way, that the war chief Harry that I mentioned, along with Osceola, helped provoke the Second Seminole War. The village he lived in was called Manatee, which almost certainly was named for the Manatee River and survivors of Angola who fled into modern-day Polk County, where the Red Stick Creeks were headquartered. So there's a great hero who's gone unrecognized, who has, I think, very close ties to this community.
I think we need to get Henry Louis Gates in here for some.
And so I can follow how you find, like when things are written down, how you were able to recover and remember it. But I am kind of fascinated both by how archaeology, how you're able to discover these very small communities and know that they were there and that this conforms to this, and also with the descendants when you don't have names and you don't have birth records. How did you discover the descendants? So I'm two related questions.
Before Uzi answers that, let me point out that he's a very modest person, and it's part of his charm. But he and his colleagues who excavated the springs in the area around the stream found 35,000 relics. Not a few little things, 35,000. Now, they don't all necessarily relate specifically to the Angola experience, but it is a massive collection of material that even someone as familiar as Uzi is, he would admit, I think, that you can only begin to comprehend what it all means.
Yeah. Thank you for let me do that. So one of the cliches in archaeology is we have a puzzle and we only have a few pieces, and our task is to find the ways to bring those pieces together. And it came about because of tremendous partners. That the Angola Maroon community, from what we know from Canter's work, who's also modest, stretched from the Braden River down to Sarasota Bay. And so the model I've used is from where the Braden River enters the Manatee River, really basically down to Jungle Gardens, just a little bit south of us. That number of 750 people, they wouldn't have lived in a nucleated community. They have suffered battles in St. Augustine in 1812, at the Apalachicola River in 1816, at Swanee in 1818. They're not going to live all together because they know people are after them. Plus the agriculturalists, the farmers. They need land for their crops, and they have cows and pigs and chickens and horses. You need space for those. You're not living all next to each other. And frankly, the traumatized people tend to want to have a little space. And we can't ignore the traumas these people have gone through at this point generationally, right, from the Middle Passage through enslavement. Even the ones who were born in Florida in freedom, still had all those raids. Plus, this was not an easy place to live back in the early 1800s. We have nice air conditioning right now. Didn't exist. We had some fragments, places that I would have loved to excavate, but it wasn't possible. I often say, and Daphne Towns is one of the descendants, and she's heard this many times, the ancestors helped. And I say that as a scholar. There was a couple in East Bradenton in the late 90s who, out of the goodness of their hearts, Trudy and Jeff Williams, had created a nonprofit to protect the area by the Manatee Mineral Spring and got the city of Bradenton to give them that responsibility. They were interested in the spring because in the 1840s, that's where the first white settlers came. And it was important during the Civil War era. They heard me speak at DeSoto National Memorial and came up to me and invited me to come and excavate. And it was their property, and so we were able to. I would not have picked that as a spot, but we had the possibilities. Community members helped out. New college students woke up early, which was unusual in those days, and came out to excavate. And in our first weekend excavation, found materials that I could date to the first decade of the 19th century. The challenge was that those materials I could date because they were British mass-produced ceramics and tobacco pipes. This did not fit my understanding of people who had been enslaved, who were living in Spanish territory. And the Spanish did not allow British goods at the time. It took another scholar, Nate Millett, up in Washington University, who hopefully, just at the same time, with no connection to us, published and started publishing, and ultimately published a book, explaining that the British were in Spanish territory, offering freedom to the Maroons if they joined the British military as colonial Marines. And they did. And they saw themselves as British subjects. It also helped answer a question when I went to the Bahamas of, even though this history was known, why they didn't see themselves as Americans. They saw themselves as Bahamian, because they understood themselves as British, and then when the Bahamas became independent, that was identity, not an American one. It was on that, because that was the ancestors were promised they could be British subjects. So we started piecing it. It was enough in that first excavation to go back, no funding, all volunteers. Then again, pulled that together in a report. It was accepted by the National Park Service. It was then put on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. There was enough interest in that the city of Bradenton wanted to revamp the park. This actually wasn't a good story as an archaeologist. But thanks to all that community support, we're able to get the funding to do the large-scale excavations in 2020. It's still only a small piece of the puzzle. There's much more to do. And there are scholars who are coming in this weekend to help continue that process.
You might mention the historical site that everyone in this room has heard of. It would be the #1 candidate.
Yes.
For the
So
dig.
just at the place where the Braden River enters the Manatee River was known, thanks to Cantor's research, as Negro Point. It's where, in the 1840s, the big house for the Braden plantation is. The house is known as the Braden Castle, because during that Third Seminole War, the Seminoles attacked it, probably because they knew the land had been a land of freedom. The Braden Castle lost its roof at the beginning of the 20th century, but it remains still there. And ethically, it's hard to argue to remove that historic site to dig under it.
But there is a published description in the late 1820s of the site with the material that remained from the ruins of Angola
Yep.
scattered on that land right where
Yep.
we think the Braden Castle
Yep.
sits.
Yeah, no, this is some of the challenges. When the first Anglo-Americans came, they landed at the Manatee Mineral Spring where there was a lone pine, and then a mile south, there was a trail where the old fields were. Using the high tech of looking at a map and seeing what's a mile from that spring, it's the Tropicana plant. If any of us ever driven past the Tropicana plant, you know it's a lot of concrete there. So that's lost. We are so lucky that that little piece of land by the Manatee Mineral Spring wasn't just preserved, but we were invited to excavate, and the materials were there to be recovered. There's more to do. Yes.
The gentleman lady said without birth certificates, without, when the maroons are offered by the British to become merchant sailors,
The Colonial Marines.
colonial marines, is that after they're ambushed, then
Ah.
they're able to go to Andros?
No. So there's two phases. You probably know this better, but I can do it as well. There's two phases to the Colonial Marines. The one part is in the Chesapeake, where, what was the name of the admiral? Yeah, I don't have it handy.
Anderson?
No. But there was that declared, thank you, that declared anyone who came on the ships would be free, and they did. We know one thanks to Sarah York, who's a student here. I want to credit, again, the students who, as a first-year student, we had on that record of those who were captured, one was labeled as Jim from the former estate of George Washington, which obviously caught our attention. Sarah, showing amazing skills as a first-year student here at New College, went through the Mount Vernon records and figured out who Jim might have been, including that he probably went on one of those British ships, brought down to the Apalachicola where a fort was built in 1814 on Prospect Bluff. It was in Pensacola in 1814 that Edward Nichols gave two speeches. Again, Professor Millet's found these speeches that I can't repeat for you now, but are just beautiful expressions of what liberty means. One to the colonial Marines, to the people of African heritage, and the other to, let me just be simple about it, the white British soldiers, telling them these are your brothers. So both, for both. That fort had hundreds of people defending freedom. It's a whole another lecture to give out that whole history. After the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson decided that fort had to go. And in July of 1816, the U.S. Navy went up that Apalachicola River, and what the U.S. Navy officers said was a lucky shot, blew up the fort, killing 300, capturing a couple of hundred people, but others escaped to Swanee by boat to Angola, and others to Trinidad, where their descendants are cousins for this long story. And they know themselves as Americans. And they have a heritage organization. Only a couple of years ago did they go up to the Apalachicola to see where the ancestors had been. So yeah, it's a very, when I started my presentation, I used the expression, this is almost unthinkable. It's because there's all these pieces that I don't expect most reasonable audiences to know about. Do they know about Edward Nichols? No. Do they know about the British call for freedom and all those who escaped? Do they know about Trinidad? Do they even know where the Andros Island in the Bahamas is? There's a lot of pieces that we're still working on sharing, and seeing young people here fills my heart with joy that they might carry to. Yes?
To confirm, there are Russians in Bahamas, who they were.
Yes. In fact, in this room.
Because when he mentioned that without, I thought, well, maybe it's just my information, but they evidently documented it well enough. And the British artifacts that were found in Angola is because they had trade with the British.
Yes, so as far as part of the modeling is at what's now DeSoto National Memorial. There's a point of land that was Shaw's Point, now DeSoto Point, and it creates a protected cove where there's a building that's known as the Tabby House Ruins, and that might have been a trading post the British used. Again, let's not oversimplify things, right? The British still had slaves. This was a military battle with the United States. There was a lot of interest here. If we want to oversimplify, we're losing the story. So it was a trade. These are folks who knew how to farm. They had access to deer and other animals there in the interior. They had the crops they were growing. They were connected to Cuban fisher folks on the coast that were connected to Havana. This is a whole world in the Gulf that's connected to the Atlantic world. We want to praise some of them, but realize they were people in their time. So we're still piecing that together.
I just wanted to, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're a couple minutes past time. We're 10 minutes past noon. So the session has technically ended, but I know that the three of us would love to stick around informally and keep talking to people. So, yeah.
But let's have one more.
Yeah.
Blessings and peace, everyone. We started listening on the webinar before coming here because we were late. And when I listened to your presentation, I was very grateful. I am Dr. Jacinta Hayes from Nassau, Bahamas. I went to Andros, to the Seminole place when I was 15 years old. And I met the grandchildren, but these were old women, these were old men, telling us the story. I saw them. I purchased the basket weaving that is identical to the ones here that were made here. I saw the sculptures. I spoke with them. I want to say, though, that I'm an educator, so I own a school, Afrocentric, because we have taken the Europeans' social ways, the way we do, we try to mimic it, struggle as we do, but we mimic it. The psychological trauma is still with us, so it's black skin, but white thinking, white masks. Intellectually, our academic institutions, still British. At my school, someone from England, a European person from England, will still come every year to sit in my temple, in my auditorium, to watch the children take the exams for validity and reliability. Culturally, the food is American. It's unfortunate. Because the crops, we don't go anymore. So when I return, I'm a former senator in the Commonwealth of Bahamas. So I was responsible for historical sites, etc. And so I just wanted to say that the people in Andros, that you were the living legacies, the ones who ran, they knew the story well, they told it, but something is happening, there's a deterioration. That's what I want to say. And so I want to say that even spiritually, we took on the European religions. We took them on. And so please, as I listen, I'm young, always me, I'm always investing in young people. But I'm always holding on to Dr. Brown. I'm holding on to Dr. Brown because, again, I'm a doctor in education, and so I use what you do. My school is built on work that you do, similar work. But I'm wondering if a group of young students could go to Andros and take pictures. You don't need to give back some of the artifacts, but if you could take photos of the artifacts, if you could take photos of the speeches, just with the handwritten, if you could find the handwritten speeches that they did, put it up in 11 by 17, a regular printer that print that, and then mount it. You have to laminate it, and then just put it in Andros so that it doesn't look like a farce or mockery. When these students now, years later, I was 15 when I went, they are 15, I'm now 60, and when I go back 60, there's nothing to go back for, except maybe some places where the archaeology could be done. But what I'm trying to say is a mockery to Giddings and what he did, because he was fighting for their lives, their protection. And so I call it SPICES, S-P-I-C-E-S. Socially, we took on the British, and psychologically, some of the things we tried to do, intellectually, culturally, but economically, it's almost like a squalor. Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless you for the work that you do, because it made me, I'm 60, but I was 15. What y'all are sharing, I say, oh my goodness, because you would think they're talking things out of their head. But now you have the evidence, so God bless you for that for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That sounds like that would be a great group ISP.
I know. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.